It's criminal how obsessed pop culture is with true crime. From ripped from the headlines TV shows to podcasts, true crime is king. Winter's Time is by the former Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court, Jeffrey Amestoy. It's the story of the big city lawyer, the small town, and murder most foul. Join us to learn about a century-old court case that could be, will be, your next true crime obsession. Good afternoon, and thanks for stopping by Across the Fence. I'm Keith Silva, in for Amy Finley. Like me, I'm sure many of you have memories of watching court trials on TV. For many, it's probably the O.J. Simpson trial. But for me, it was Klaus von Bülow. As a kid growing up in southeastern Massachusetts, I followed that trial like it was the Red Sox that year. Rich socialites, attempted murder, larger-than-life lawyers. Today, we're talking about an even bigger trial that took place 100 years ago in little old Woodstock, Vermont. It's chronicled in Winter's Time, which has one of the best subheadings you'll ever read: a secret pledge, a severed head, and the murder that brought America's most famous lawyer to Vermont. The author is someone of some renown in Vermont law circles, the former Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court, Jeffrey Amestoy. Welcome Across the Fence, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Keith. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. I don't want to jinx myself, but you are the only judge I've ever appeared in front of, and let's hope you are the one and only. Yes. You open this book with a great anecdote proving that you know a good story when you hear one. Tell us about that story.
So, when I was a young lawyer, very first appearance in court, I was in Woodstock, Vermont, nervously awaiting my appearance in court, and sort of try to hide my apprehension where I was in the lawyer's room. I said to one of the senior lawyers, and of course they're all senior to me, what's the picture on the wall? So it was really a way of hiding my anxiety at the wall. And he said, well, that's of the most famous murder trial ever to be tried in this courthouse. So that got me sort of interested in the case. And then a couple of years later, I was actually as an assistant attorney general researching the law, came across the case called State versus Winters. The defendant's name was John Winters. So I was reading the Vermont Supreme Court case. And in the Vermont Supreme Court cases, they always list the lawyers that appear for both the prosecution and the defense. And it said, appearing for the defendant, Clarence Darrow of Chicago, Illinois. Well, that really astounded me because Clarence Darrow was as famous as in the Roaring Twenties as, I don't know, Charlie Chaplin or Babe Ruth.
Calvin
Coolidge. And to read that he had appeared in Vermont in a murder trial and argued a case before the Vermont Supreme Court, I thought, well, that'll make a good book someday. So it took me a while to get to it.
Well, we'll get to the attorney for the damned in a minute, but you mentioned his name. Who was John Winters?
So John Winters, the defendant, he worked as a machinist at the Cone Blanchard Company. And part of the context to remember here is that the murder happened in Windsor, Vermont, where he lived. And the victim, Cecilia Gulvin, was probably the highest female executive in Vermont, a very important player in the machine tool industry, which was really like the Silicon Valley of the time. Machine tools were revolutionizing American industry, and Precision Valley, and Windsor was the center of it, had these enormous companies. Cecilia Gulvin was basically number 2 in charge of that company. And Winters was one of the many machinists that probably had 1,000 employees there. So he worked there.
And Cecilia Gullivan, you said prominent woman.
Yes.
She was also an unmarried woman,
yes.
Very, very high up in this company. So a lot of things about her which sort of talk about, the prosperity of the 20s, the roaring 20s, but also still, very conservative, an unmarried woman at the head of this company.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, so Windsor's small then, still small, about 4,000, 4,500 people. But she was sort of to many men and women, the epitome of the roaring 20s woman. Right. She was dressed in the fashions of the 20s, very accomplished. Drove her own car, which was somewhat unusual. And owned it, and built her own house, which was certainly unusual. So, you had both this tension between someone who is really well respected and known for being sort of the modern woman of the 20s,
Right.
and then you had still the small town pushback that was skeptical of that she was not in the right place.
Right. A woman in power.
Yeah,
My teenage daughters would call her a girl boss nowadays, I think.
Yeah, I've got 3 daughters, so
Okay.
I know about girl bosses.
Okay. One of the things that's interesting about the book is you really set the stage. You give us a context. The Roaring 20s, as much as we think about it, as being a big city thing, Vermont is as much in the spotlight as it's ever been. Calvin Coolidge is in the White
Right.
House. A Vermont farmer, if
Yeah.
you want to lean into the lore,
Yeah.
also a lawyer,
Yeah.
is in charge of the country. What is going on in Vermont in the 20s?
So, in addition to the presence and of a Vermonter as president of the United States, he appointed a fellow Vermonter as Attorney General of the United States, who had gone to the Black River Academy with, and at the point in time of when the 1926 when the murder takes place, there really was a tremendous focus on the state of Vermont.
Windsor, important at both times,
Yes,
being
that's right.
the birthplace
Yeah,
of Vermont.
Yeah.
The trial began in January 1927, and the special prosecutor brings a witness, so to speak. Tell us about this extraordinary bit of lawyering.
So in the context of the book, one of the things I mentioned is since I'd been Attorney General in 1926, 2027, there was only the Attorney General's office. Probably now the Attorney General's office has 150 lawyers. When I was there, it had 50 lawyers. But in those days, the Attorney General was the only lawyer, and he knew right away, as attorneys general tend to know, you're often not the best lawyer in the office. So he went to the governor. They appointed a special prosecutor, a lawyer out of White River Junction, Vermont, considered the best trial lawyer in Vermont. And the special prosecutor knew it was a circumstantial case, and he had to put together some extraordinary strategic choices and tactics in order to try to convict Winters, and most significantly was the use of the victim's head as an exhibit.
So Gullivan's head was brought into the courtroom. That must have been quite a shock.
Yeah, so it was a shock to me. I was reading the transcript 100 years later. As far as it had never certainly happened in Vermont.
Sure.
And as far as I know, it had never happened in the United States.
Right.
The victim's head had been severed by the medical examiner. The prosecution's theory was that a chisel used to murder the victim fit the wounds in the head. So that was the demonstration in front of the jury. And as you can imagine, it was extraordinary front page news really all over the...
Definitely.
And what was significant about it as well was the defense lawyers failed to object to the introduction of it as an exhibit, which then meant that it couldn't be used as an issue to appeal to the Vermont Supreme Court.
Right.
And of course, had they objected and preserved it, the case would have definitely been reversed on that basis.
Right.
But they let it in. Very hard to get a neutral jury, I think, after that's an exhibit.
So you're saying bringing a severed head in, not the best, perhaps, idea. I think
it worked for the prosecution.
It worked.
But as I indicated, I couldn't find another case in the United States in criminal trial history.
So Winters is convicted on February 18th, 1927. Yep. Why is the verdict significant?
Well, I mean, it's significant in the sense that, first of all, it's significant because it's a highly publicized murder case, and it's significant because in Vermont you had the death penalty then, and so he's immediately he's sentenced to die in the electric chair. One of the contexts of the 1920s was there was really a race throughout the United States to reimpose the death penalty if a state didn't have it, or introduce electric chairs, which were relatively new.
Right.
Vermont went from death by hanging to the electric chair in 1913 or 1914. So this was extraordinary cases for that context too. Here is somebody who was sentenced to die in the electric chair. And of course, that was one of the reasons it became significant to Clarence Darrow.
Right, and that's how we get Darrow into the story, but not without this very interesting, only in Vermont sort of thing is the pledge. Tell us about this secret pledge and how it's connected to Darrow.
So Clarence Darrow's son went to Dartmouth, graduated in 1904. Darrow, in fact, had just announced his retirement in 1927. He was 70 years old. He said he was not going to take any more cases. He was going to lecture. He begins his lecture tour at Dartmouth, where his son had gone to college. And as he finishes his lecture, a woman comes up to him and says, I have a letter from you, a letter that my son, that your son wrote to me in 1904. And Darrow goes, I don't even know what, yeah. Has no idea what it's about. And it turns out it's a pledge from Darrow's son, Paul, to this family that if they were ever in trouble, Clarence Darrow, his father, would come help them. And the pledge was given because Paul Darrow, 3 days before he was to graduate, ran over a 5-year-old boy. He was on horseback. Horse was spooked by a steam engine, and he wasn't at fault, but he was so devastated by the accident, he made this pledge. And so Darrow, never been told by his son, now has this, and immediately says to the woman, yes, I'll help you. Writes Paul the next day and said, you never told me about this, but I'm glad to be able to help her.
Yeah, and the boy who was killed is related to John Winter's family.
Yes.
Last question, which is, so Darrow comes to Vermont. How does the appeal go?
Well, there's actually 2 appeals.
Okay. We got about a minute left.
And the court splits. It's a 5-member court, so there's obviously 2 for conviction and 2 for acquittal. The 5th justice can't make up his mind. They have to wait till the 5th justice finally leaves the court. A new justice is appointed, and then they bring Darrow back for a second argument. The court decides 3-2 to reverse the conviction. And then facing the electric chair, the state offers Winters a plea deal. If you plead to a second-degree murder, you'll avoid the death penalty. Darrow tells Winters, take it, because you're going to be convicted if you go back to trial.
Right. Well, Justice Amestoy, thank you very much. I hope folks get the book. Winter's Time is published by the Vermont Historical Society and is available wherever you get books. Here and Across the Fence, we always encourage you to visit your local library. My thanks to the team behind the scenes here at WCX who always keep me off the streets and out of the courts. I'm Keith Silva. This is Across the Fence. Thanks for being part of our family.